The night was thick with an eerie silence, the kind that wrapped itself around the town like a suffocating shroud. Not a single breeze stirred the trees, and even the nocturnal creatures that usually roamed freely stayed hidden in their burrows and nests, sensing the unnatural stillness that blanketed the land. It was a silence that promised only one thing. Something unspeakable was about to happen. At the edge of town, nestled between the gnarled roots of ancient trees, stood an old, decrepit mansion. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, a relic of a forgotten time that seemed to rot and fester along with the twisted forest that surrounded it. The mansion was a grotesque monolith, its windows like empty eye sockets, black and uninviting. The wooden walls were splintered and weathered, giving the impression that the entire structure could collapse with a single gust of wind. But the mansion never collapsed. It stood, defying time and nature, as if it were held together by something far more sinister than mere wood and stone. The townsfolk knew better than to go near it, whispering in hushed tones about the horrors that had once occurred within its walls. Some said it was cursed, others believed it was a portal to another realm, a gateway through which the damned could slip back into the world of the living. But the truth was far more terrifying than any of their whispered suspicions. For within that mansion lived a man, if he could still be called that, known only as the Collector. He was a being of unspeakable evil, a creature who had long since forsaken his humanity in pursuit of something far more twisted. The Collector was obsessed with death, but not in the way a normal man might fear or revere it. No, his fascination ran deeper, darker. He was drawn to the very essence of what made a person who they were, their soul. The Collector was a master of dark rituals, ancient practices that had been lost to time, buried in forgotten tombs and unread grimoires. He had discovered a way to trap souls, to rip them from the bodies of the living and store them in vessels of his own design. These vessels took many forms: cursed dolls with glassy eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went, ancient urns covered in cryptic symbols, mirrors that reflected not your image, but the tortured faces of the souls imprisoned within. Each soul was a trophy, a testament to his power, and the mansion was filled with them. It was a museum of the damned, where the air was thick with the despair of the countless spirits trapped within its walls. Each one had a story, a life cut short by the Collector's insatiable hunger. The Collector's methods were as varied as they were gruesome. Sometimes, he would lure his victims into the mansion with promises of wealth or forbidden knowledge. Other times, he would stalk them in the dead of night, emerging from the shadows like a phantom, his cold, skeletal hands snatching them from their beds and dragging them back to his lair. Once inside, there was no escape. The Collector's mansion was a labyrinth of darkness, its corridors twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. Those unfortunate enough to find themselves within its walls would wander for what felt like an eternity, their minds unraveling as they were tormented by the whispers of the souls that came before them. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the very fabric of the mansion infused with the suffering of its countless victims. And then, when their spirit was broken, when they had been reduced to nothing more than a quivering shell of their former self, the Collector would strike. He would perform the ritual, a grotesque ceremony that involved ancient symbols drawn in blood, chants in a language long dead, and the inevitable, horrifying moment when the victim's soul was torn from their body, screaming in agony as it was trapped forever in one of the Collector's cursed vessels. The body, now an empty husk, would be discarded, left to rot in the mansion's bowels. The Collector had no use for the flesh. It was the soul he craved, the essence of life that he could hoard and admire like a macabre collection of rare jewels. But the Collector was not satisfied. His hunger was insatiable, a gnawing void that could never be filled, no matter how many souls he claimed. He had lived for centuries, sustained by the very souls he collected, and as time wore on, his methods became more brutal, his rituals more depraved. He would not stop until he had collected them all, until the entire town, perhaps the entire world, was nothing more than an extension of his grisly gallery. As the years passed, the town began to fade, its streets emptying as people fled the growing darkness. They knew, deep down, that something was wrong. that the collector's influence was spreading like a cancer. Those who stayed behind lived in constant fear, their eyes haunted by the knowledge that, one day, they too would hear the soft footsteps in the night, the cold whisper of the collector as he came for them. But there were always some who refused to believe, who thought the stories were nothing more than the ramblings of the superstitious and the mad. They would venture near the mansion, daring each other to step closer, to peer into the windows and see if they could catch a glimpse of the horrors inside. They never returned, and so the mansion remained, a dark blot on the landscape, a reminder of the evil that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. The collector continued his work, his collection growing with each passing year, the walls of his mansion groaning under the weight of the souls trapped within. But the collector was patient. He knew that, eventually, they would all come to him. They always did. And when they did, he would be ready, his hands itching to add another soul to his twisted collection, to trap another life in the endless nightmare that was his existence. For the collector knew one thing above all else: death was not the end. It was merely the beginning of his dark, eternal game. The air inside the mansion was thick, suffocating, as though it clung to your skin and seeped into your lungs, each breath a struggle. The darkness was absolute, swallowing the light from any lantern or torch foolishly brought in by those brave, or stupid, enough to enter. The only illumination came from the occasional flicker of candles, their flames sputtering weakly, as if they too feared the shadows that crowded around them. The corridors seemed endless, winding and twisting in ways that defied logic. There was no rhyme or reason to their layout. They spiraled downward into the bowels of the mansion, where the walls were damp with a cold, clammy moisture that smelled of rot and decay. The deeper you went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as though the very air was infused with the agony of the souls that had been ripped from their bodies and trapped within the mansion's cursed vessels. It was in these depths that the collector did his work. His lair was a chamber deep below the mansion, accessible only by a narrow, spiraling staircase that descended into the earth like a corkscrew. The stairs were worn smooth from centuries of use, their edges crumbling in places, and they seemed to absorb the sound of your footsteps, rendering the journey into the abyss eerily silent. The chamber itself was a grotesque parody of a cathedral, its vaulted ceiling lost in the shadows above. Stone pillars lined the walls, carved with nightmarish scenes of torture and suffering, their surfaces slick with a dark, oily substance that seemed to pulsate with a life of its own. The floor was a mosaic of black and crimson tiles, arranged in a pattern that made your head swim if you looked at it for too long, as though the design was meant to disorient and confuse. At the center of the chamber was an altar, a monstrous slab of stone that had been stained dark with the blood of countless victims. It was here that the collector performed his rituals, each one more depraved and horrific than the last. The altar was surrounded by shelves, each one lined with the vessels that contained the souls he had captured. The cursed dolls sat in neat rows, their glassy eyes staring blankly into the darkness, while the urns and mirrors reflected the dim light of the chamber, their surfaces flickering with the faces of the damned. The collector stood before the altar, his tall, gaunt figure shrouded in a cloak of deepest black. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but his eyes, those cold, inhuman eyes, glowed with a malevolent light. They were the eyes of a predator, of a being that had long since lost any semblance of humanity. His hands, pale and skeletal, moved with a practiced precision as he arranged the instruments of his dark trade. A curved blade, its edge honed to a razor's sharpness. A chalice, engraved with runes that seemed to writhe and shift of their own accord. And a book, its pages yellowed with age, filled with the ancient, forbidden knowledge that had enabled him to master the art of soul collection. Tonight, a new soul would be added to his collection. The victim lay bound on the altar, their eyes wide with terror, their mouth gagged to stifle their screams. They struggled weakly against their bonds, their strength sapped by the fear that coursed through their veins. The collector paid no mind to their futile attempts at escape. He had seen it all before, countless times, and each time it filled him with the same cold satisfaction. He began the ritual, chanting in a guttural, ancient tongue that echoed off the stone walls. the words reverberating through the chamber like the tolling of a funeral bell. The symbols etched into the altar began to glow, a sickly green light that cast twisted shadows across the victim's face, their eyes reflecting the terror of what was about to happen. As the chanting reached a fever pitch, the collector raised the blade high above his head, its edge gleaming in the dim light. With a swift, practiced motion, he brought it down, slicing through flesh and bone with a sickening ease. Blood splattered across the altar, pooling around the body, but the collector's focus was on the soul that had just been severed from its earthly vessel. The victim's body convulsed, their eyes rolling back in their head as their soul was torn from them, a shimmering, ethereal essence that hovered above the altar, writhing in agony. The collector reached out, his hand closing around the soul, his touch cold and unyielding. He could feel its fear, its desperation to escape, but there was no mercy in him. He channeled the energy, funneling it into one of the cursed vessels, a small, intricately carved doll with eyes that seemed to glitter with malicious intelligence. The doll's eyes flickered, the glassy orbs coming to life as the soul was imprisoned within. The collector felt a surge of satisfaction as he placed the doll on one of the shelves, its tiny body now filled with the essence of a life that had once been. The ritual was complete, another soul added to his ever-growing collection, but as he turned away from the altar, a whisper echoed through the chamber, faint but unmistakable. It was a voice, soft and trembling, yet filled with a determination that the collector had not encountered in centuries. "You will not keep me here," the voice hissed, the words barely audible but filled with a venomous intent. Asterisk, "I will find a way out. I will make you pay." Asterisk. The collector paused, his cold eyes narrowing as he scanned the chamber. The voice had come from the doll, the one he had just filled with the fresh soul. It was rare for a soul to retain such a strong sense of self after the ritual, and even rarer for it to speak. The collector's interest was piqued, but he felt no fear. He was the master here, the keeper of souls, and no mere mortal could threaten him. He moved closer to the doll, his hand reaching out to touch its cold, porcelain face. The eyes glared back at him, filled with a hatred that burned like a fire, and for the briefest of moments, the collector felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, unease. But then the moment passed, and the collector dismissed the voice as nothing more than the last vestiges of a fading will. The soul would soon succumb to the overwhelming despair of its imprisonment, as they all did, and it would be just another trophy in his collection, another victory in his endless pursuit of power. Yet, as he turned away and walked back up the spiral staircase, leaving the chamber and its cursed contents behind, the collector couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive, as though the very air was watching him, waiting. And in the depths of the mansion, the doll's eyes continued to glare into the darkness, its porcelain lips twisted into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Days turned into weeks, and the unease that had settled in the collector's mind began to grow, festering like a wound that refused to heal. The mansion, once his sanctuary, now felt like a prison, its dark corridors twisting in ways that even he, their master, could no longer fully navigate. Whispers echoed through the walls, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing day, until they became an incessant chorus of voices that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The collector knew every soul in his collection. He had taken them all himself, felt their terror as they were torn from their bodies, heard their final, desperate pleas for mercy. But these whispers were different, angrier, more defiant. It was as if the souls were rallying against him, their collective hatred for their captor boiling over into a tide of malice that threatened to consume him. And always, at the forefront of this growing rebellion, was the voice of the doll. The soul he had captured that night had refused to be broken, its will as unyielding as iron. It taunted him, cursed him, promising retribution that sent icy tendrils of fear creeping up the collector's spine. He tried to silence it, tried to drown out the voices with his rituals and dark incantations, but nothing worked. The doll's voice only grew stronger, its hatred more palpable, until it became the only thing he could hear. The collector's once proud demeanor began to crack. He no longer walked with the confidence of a predator, but with the paranoia of the hunted. He avoided the Chamber of Souls, afraid to face the doll and the wrath it harbored. The mansion, his eternal home, now felt alive with a dark energy, the very walls seeming to pulse with the anger of the trapped souls. The collector's sleep was haunted by nightmares, visions of the souls he had collected breaking free from their vessels, their ghostly forms swirling around him, dragging him down into a pit of darkness from which there was no escape. He would wake in a cold sweat, the whispers still echoing in his ears, the sensation of cold, skeletal hands gripping his throat. He tried to fight back, to reassert his dominance over the souls, but his power was waning. The rituals that had once come so easily to him now faltered, the dark energies he wielded slipping through his fingers like sand. The mansion, once his fortress, had turned against him, its walls closing in, the corridors twisting into an inescapable maze. Then came the night when everything changed. The collector was in his study, poring over the ancient tomes that had once given him power, desperately searching for a way to silence the voices. But the words on the pages seemed to blur, the ink running like blood, the symbols shifting into grotesque shapes that danced mockingly before his eyes. A sudden crash echoed through the mansion, the sound of glass shattering, followed by the unmistakable clatter of something falling to the floor. The collector froze, his heart pounding in his chest as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The voices were no longer content to stay within the walls. They were coming for him. He raced through the dark corridors, his footsteps echoing off the stone. The oppressive silence of the mansion now replaced by a cacophony of voices that swirled around him like a storm. They taunted him, screamed his name, called for his blood. The collector's fear mounted with every step, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he reached the door to the Chamber of Souls. The door stood ajar, a thin sliver of darkness spilling out from within. The collector hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He knew what he would find inside, but he had no choice. If he was to regain control, he had to face the source of the disturbance. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The chamber was bathed in darkness, the only light coming from the flickering candles that lined the walls. The shelves were empty, the cursed vessels that had once held his prized collection of souls now shattered, their contents released into the room. The air was thick with a cold, malevolent energy, the spirits of the damned swirling around him, their ghostly forms twisted in anguish and rage. And there, in the center of the chamber, stood the doll. It was no longer just a vessel. It had transformed, its porcelain skin cracked and blackened, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. The collector could feel the soul within it, its hatred burning hotter than ever, feeding off the other souls that had been released. It was no longer just a soul. It was a force of vengeance, a manifestation of all the pain and suffering the collector had inflicted over the centuries. The doll's eyes locked onto the collector, and for the first time in his long, cursed life, he felt true fear. It wasn't just the doll. It was the souls, all of them, united in their desire for retribution. They surged toward him, their ghostly forms merging into a swirling mass of darkness that filled the chamber, their voices a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the mansion. The collector tried to flee, but the darkness closed in around him, cold hands reaching out to drag him down into the abyss. He screamed, but no sound escaped his lips, his voice swallowed by the vengeful spirits that surrounded him. He could feel them tearing at him, ripping away his power, his very essence, until he was nothing more than a husk, a shadow of the being he once was. The souls had their revenge, and the mansion that had stood for centuries crumbled under the weight of their fury, the walls collapsing inward as the darkness consumed everything. The collector was dragged down into the pit, his screams echoing through the void as the souls exacted their final, terrible justice. And when the dawn came, the mansion was gone, reduced to nothing more than a smoldering ruin, its dark secrets buried beneath the earth. The town, freed from the collector's influence, slowly began to heal, the shadows that had haunted its streets receding into memory. But the legend of the collector lived on, a cautionary tale whispered in the dark corners of the town, a reminder of the evil that once lurked in the old, decrepit mansion at the edge of the forest. And though the collector was gone, his cursed vessel shattered and his soul lost to the abyss, there were those who claimed to hear whispers in the night, faint and distant, as if the souls of the damned were still searching for a way to exact their final revenge. For the collector may have been defeated, but the darkness he had sown would never truly die. It would linger, waiting for the next unwary soul to stumble upon it, to awaken the ancient, malevolent force that had once claimed so many lives. And when it did, the collector's legacy would begin anew, the cycle of death and despair repeating itself, forever bound to the cursed land where the mansion once stood.